Hey everybody! So I hope your weekend's going really well. We just had that gig at La Jicara in Oaxaca with me and Negrita Yani and her partner Pablo and Sandy Nova, the poet from Mexico City, and another guy called Pablo, a second Pablo. I think there were at least three Pablos at that gig, but another Pablo who's also from Buenos Aires, like Yanni and her partner Pablo. This Pablo Meckler, took some incredible photos of that gig, and I made a slideshow of that I put on YouTube and TikTok. So if you're into that sort of thing, they're really cool photos. I was like really amazed. Like just an incredible photographer. We've been really lucky with like just incredible photographers. Um, in fact, I was just thinking about France de Griesen, who's singing on my next album, and I'm singing on her next album, and I'm doing a documentary about her album. She's also a photographer, and she's an incredible photographer, and she's done some incredible photography. And of course, she can't be the photographer all the time because she's also a performer. But she just knows all these incredible photographers. We've just been so lucky with that. Renaud Monfony from Les Inrocks did these great photos of us. This romantic punk photo shoot, the romantic punk photo shoot on our romantic punk tour earlier this year, did some really cool photos of us and put them on the Les Inrocks blog. So you should check that out if you're into photos of us with flowers in our hair and cool makeup. France styled us for that. She actually styled me for the gig the other night because she was the one who picked out my outfit, that gold overshirt. She was the one, and she's a professional stylist. So like people were like, "Oh, I love your outfit, que chido su playera," and I was like, "It's my friend who's a stylist picked it out. I can't take credit for that. I can't take credit for things that I didn't do." She did that, and she's absolutely incredible. So we're just really lucky about that. We're lucky about a lot of things. And I made this video the other day about a lot of different things. I ramble for like 30 minutes in it. Hopefully I ramble less in this one. I'm sensing a pattern here. That I'm hoping to break that pattern because the last two like vlogs I've done have been like 30 minutes long. So I hope this one isn't 30 minutes long. Unless you really like that. I mean, some people really like these like much longer form videos. And that's cool. I was just thinking, it was my friend Dr. Bhairavi Balasubramaniam, the Sky Priestess, who inspired me originally to start doing this kind of video. And she does really long videos sometimes. And she was very inspired by Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, from the TV show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and she has a whole series on her YouTube. Shout out to her, by the way, Dr. Bhairavi, the Sky Priestess. She has a whole series on her page called Hello Neighbor, and it's basically just like her talking to her community of like people who subscribe to her on YouTube, and people who are just tuning in, which is inspired by Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and it's sort of, she's very humble about it. She's like, I'm hoping to do justice to what he did. And she does. I mean, I feel like she does a really good job of it. And, she's someone who talks about a lot of different topics. She talks about political science. She talks about astrology. She talks about kind of all different kinds of things, pop culture, cats. And really, she's just bringing this kind of vibe in what she does. And it's not so much about like the words that she says, or sort of the intellectual, exercises that, it's much more about the heart that she's putting into it and like the community that she's building around it. And that's kind of what I'm hoping to emulate with this is, like to cheer people up, to make people happy, to make people laugh. If you're like actually learning from what I'm saying, like specific, facts and things like that, that's really cool. And also that there's no homework assignment. There's not going to be a quiz on this. I don't know if you can hear that, but there's a lot of dogs barking in the background. There are a lot of dogs. So in terms of neighbors, because we're talking about Hello Neighbor and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Where I'm out in the countryside in Oaxaca, and we have a lot of neighbors, and most of them are dogs and cows and pigs. My dog Apollo, who's starred in my music video for my song Manhattan, I Am a Sheep, him and also Cannonball the dog. Not Cannonball the person who is me, but Cannonball the dog, the original Cannonball, the one I borrowed my name from with permission. They're both in that video. And Apollo was out here. He still is out here in the countryside. And he fell in love with a pig. One of his neighbors at one point, he fell in love with this pig. It was really sweet. They were like, pressing their faces up to each other and I don't really know what happened with that. Like, I don't think they've seen each other in a while, but it was just really sweet. And, if you know Apollo, and you do know Apollo if you've seen those videos, he's just the world's sweetest dog. So was Cannonball. They're actually relatives. My dad is always mentioning that because we didn't know that they were relatives until we looked at their papers and we found out that, like, Cannonball was actually Apollo's great uncle. We didn't know that, but apparently, yeah, they're very closely related to each other, and they couldn't be more different in terms of personality. But like, they just are the best dogs in the world. Cannonball sadly is no longer with us. He died in 2017, the night that I recorded Cackles in Berlin, and I was really sad about that because I wasn't with him when he died. But I didn't feel like there was anything unresolved there. Like, we were with each other in that other sense, the non-physical sense. And he was really like my dog and I was his human. We were very, very close. That's why I kept that name, sort of, to honor him, because for a while I was considering changing my stage name because since Cannonball had died, but people were like, no, you should keep it, in memory of him. And that's what I'm doing. I might start releasing some music as Jesse Statman again, because before 2012, I actually released my music as Jesse Statman, which is, like my birth name. And the reason I changed my stage name to Cannonball was specifically because of my hand injury in 2012. I had a hand injury, and I changed my style of how I play guitar and write songs and perform to compensate for that hand injury, to accommodate for that. And I started playing in this alternate tuning and a very different style so that I could play guitar with just one finger. And I started writing songs in a very different way, and it was sort of like a grounding exercise for like being back into my physical body after the trauma of that hand injury, and as a way of recovering from that. And I started writing songs about, topics that were very like grounding and very physical. Like, I was writing a lot of songs about animals and about farms and about, also about serial killers and like, about all these kinds of topics, and with this kind of sound and with this kind of energy that's, when I was Jesse Statman, and I still am Jesse Statman, but like when I was making music as Jesse Statman, it was like love songs and metaphysical songs and, stuff that was not so much in the physical. And, then as Cannonball Statman, I became very grounded in certain things. I didn't decide to change my name to Cannonball Statman at first. At first, it was a band. It was always a band. And so when I played solo, I was Jesse Statman, and when I had the band that played the songs that I wrote with my hand injury, it was Cannonball Statman. And it was actually Audrey Otherway, shout out to Audrey Otherway, who came up with the idea for me to keep going with calling the band Cannonball Statman, because it was originally a one-off. It was originally just going to be this thing where I had this gig at Goodbye Blue Monday in Bushwick. Shout out to Goodbye Blue Monday. Rest in peace, Goodbye Blue Monday. That was like the best place on earth. And rest in peace, Steve Trimboli, the guy who started it, who also ran a bar called Scrap Bar in the 80s. in downtown Manhattan. There's really incredible New York guy, did more for New York than pretty much anyone. Um, a really incredible guy. We dearly miss him. He did a lot for me. He did a lot for pretty much everyone who came through New York ever. So anyway, and originally Cannonball Statman was going to be something that did one gig at Goodbye Blue Monday in the spring of 2012, and it was just going to be one thing. And it was Audrey Otherway, who I was in an experimental writing group with at the time, and we were doing this radio interview that actually never aired because they had technical glitches with it. And I gave a flyer to Audrey while we were doing that interview, and Audrey was like, "Oh, Cannonball Statman, that sounds like a really good name for a hardcore band." I was like, "Oh, it's just the name of my dog. Like, this is like this one-off gig, and like I thought it would be funny to perform, with this band named after my dog as like one gig, like just one gig." And Audrey was like, "No, you should keep going with that." Audrey's doing really well, apparently. Like, she's in all these different bands that like people know about, like big indie bands from New York. But I always remember Audrey as like just this really cool poet who also I produced one of her demos when I was, me and my parents were on vacation up in like Woodstock, New York, on Muse Road, a road called Muse Road. Only in Woodstock, New York, would you have a Muse Road. And I had a little like home recording set up on Muse Road for that week or so. And so Audrey Otherway came up to Muse Road and recorded a demo for her project Little Waste that I produced. I was really happy. She's so cool. And also my buddy Ian, who was the panda in the Cannonball Statman band, also came up to the house on Muse Road, I think that same week, or maybe a week later or something, and just recorded this crazy, like, unhinged monologue about me that made no sense, and it was so cool. And I said it to music. I don't know if I still have it, but it was just like the funniest thing I've ever heard. I hope I still have it. Shout out to both of those people. Ian Garcia, who wore a panda outfit, a full body panda suit, and did yoga on stage and danced with my band at a bunch of gigs. And Audrey Otherway, who plays in Mal Bloom and Speedy Ortiz and a bunch of other bands that I'm like really out of touch for whatever reason. Like, I never know like who, but those are the bands that I know about that Audrey's in, and it's really cool stuff. Yeah, and Little Waste is her other project. I don't know if she's still, maybe she's doing it under the name Audrey Otherway. This is like how out of touch I am with some of the New York scene, that I'm like, do those people even still live in New York? Because a lot of people actually left New York, as I said in that video. And so this was so I changed my name to Cannonball Statman as a performer after Audrey Otherway inspired me to keep going with that band as Cannonball Statman. And then when I got involved in the New York anti-folk scene, which happened so randomly, I had no idea what anti-folk even was. I grew up in New York, which is where anti-folk was born and died. And after it lived for like almost 40 years, that was an incredible scene. But most people in New York don't actually know what anti-folk is or have never heard of it. And I was no exception. I had no idea what that was. And there was a very drunk poet at one of my gigs at Goodbye Blue Monday, actually, that same year, who came up to me after my set and said, "Hey, I'm a total asshole. I have no idea what you did because I was talking with my friend the whole time you were playing, so I didn't hear anything you did. But you're anti-folk, and you should play at the Sidewalk Cafe, which is the home of anti-folk." And I was like, I have no idea what that is, but I'll take your word for it. And that's how I got involved in that scene. That poet later became a good friend of mine. And he told me like kind of the whole story of that scene. So anyway, then the folks on that scene were the ones who inspired me to actually keep with the name Cannonball Statman for my solo project. So that's why when I do these tours, people say it's Cannonball Statman instead of Jesse Statman. And the reason for that is actually because of, in the anti-folk scene, when you would perform with a band, like if you were known for playing with that band, people would often refer to you by a combination of your name and the name of that band. So like Luke Kelly had a band called Kung Fu Crime Wave, and so they would call him Kung Fu Luke. Or like Chris from Crazy in the Brains, they would call him Chris Crazy. So instead of calling me Jesse Statman, people would call me Jesse Cannonball Statman, and then they just shortened that to Cannonball Statman because it's a fun name. So the reason I made this video is actually shout out to Andy Halliwell, who's an incredible artist, a multimedia artist. He makes music, he's a photographer, he's a videographer. You've probably seen some of his work if you follow me on here, because he's filmed a lot of my gigs in Darwin, Lancashire, in the UK at Number 39 Bar, which is also an absolutely incredible venue. I don't know if it's still around, actually, because they were saying that it closed recently, and if that's the case, rest in peace, because that was an absolutely incredible venue, and that's an incredible scene. Darwin, Lancashire has just an incredible music scene. JD Meatyard was the guy who introduced me to that scene on my first UK tour back in 2015. We did this whole tour together, and since then I played in Darwin a number of times. And J.D. Meatyard summed it up in one of his songs. He said, "Darwin, music town." It's a music town. Absolutely incredible place. And so the reason I made this video is because Andy mentioned something really important, actually, which is that I should write a song about people leaving New York. And that I should write a song about people leaving New York. I've never written a song about people leaving New York. I've written songs about people trying to leave New York, but I've never written a song about people leaving New York. And so, like, you know, my song After Rain Over Brooklyn is like, you know, like she's still trying to get out of Brooklyn, and a lot of people are. And I'd never actually written a song about people leaving New York. And I never know, like, you know, what people know about New York and other places. I always feel like people outside of New York know a little bit more about New York than people in New York, because people in New York don't have time to know things about New York. We're too busy doing things in New York. And people in the UK know a lot about New York. That's actually a thing that people in New York need to know about, that actually, because our scene in New York, like, you know, the anti-folk scene and a lot of other scenes that I've had things to do with, you know, like that really, like when I was growing up, I learned a lot about performing and about making music from these different scenes in New York. And the anti-folk scene especially, a lot of anti-folk artists are known in Europe and in various parts of the UK. And the reason for that is largely because Rough Trade Records, a record label from the north of England, released a lot of anti-folk artists' music in the 2000s. And because of that, and for other reasons, we've always had a really special relationship with the north of England. And a lot of people in New York don't know about that. And they know that we have a special relationship with the UK, but they don't know that we have a special relationship with the north of England specifically. They don't know about the north-south divide as much. It's just not something that people talk about in the US. And because of that, like, I've heard a lot of stories, including from friends, like from New York and from other scenes from the US, who like wanted to do things in the UK. And so like they spent some time in London and they couldn't afford to live in London. So like they rented, a friend of mine like rented a closet in a nursing home for like 100 quid, and was like living on Hershey's bars. Like it was that kind of thing, like not eating, not really sleeping, like really bad living conditions. London is notorious for bad living conditions, but London is also notorious for not being the place that you would want to be a musician in the UK. Like if you're from a US scene, especially like a scene in New York that has, you know, close ties with the north of England, you would want to spend time in like Manchester, or Liverpool or Darwin. You wouldn't want to spend time in London, like the city that is notorious for hating the north and for hating musicians from the north and for doing whatever it can to take advantage of musicians without really doing anything for the musicians. So then you have these musicians from New York who come back to New York and tell horror stories of living in the UK, as in living in London, which is a very different place from other parts of the UK. And then people don't think about maybe you should spend some time in the north. And actually, I was really lucky in this way because JD Meatyard organized my first UK tour, and he's from the UK, so he knows about this sort of thing. So my first UK tour was like, we did 14 gigs in the north of England and 1 gig in Bristol, and that was it. And we just had the best time. I mean, it was an incredible tour. And we didn't play in London. We didn't play anywhere in the south except for Bristol. And yeah, I mean, it was absolutely incredible. And on that, I built a lot of, like my, UK tours after that, following that, in 2016, 2017, 2018. I don't think I did a UK tour in 2019. I actually did an impromptu gig at the Victoria, Dalston in London, while I was recording Miracle on Neon Clown Avenue in London in 2019. I think that was like my first or second ever proper London gig. I just really never had that much interest in playing London, and it was kind of random that we got asked to do this impromptu gig while we were breaking into the studio where my drummer works to do late night recording sessions to do that album. And we got invited by this group of Italian musicians who was doing a lot of stuff at the studio at the time to do an impromptu set showcasing some of the songs that we were doing for that album. So that was my first really proper London gig. I think I did one other London gig before that, and it was not even a real gig in a lot of ways. And so just thinking about that, that was, then I hadn't even really thought about doing a London gig because I'd been doing all these other gigs. And so the reason I did this video is because Andy brought this up, you should do a song about why people leave New York, or a song about people leaving New York. I really should do that, and I'm going to work on one. In the meantime, I'm doing this video where I'm kind of rambling again. And I think I need to figure out how to ramble less, unless you like it. And I was just thinking about this, there's a lot of people who listen to 3-hour podcasts of, people talking. So, if you like the sound of my voice, that might make all the difference. I'm not a good judge of this because, as I said, I don't like the sound of my speaking voice. I've gotten used to the sound of my singing voice, but not the sound of my speaking voice. I'm still getting used to that. So Andy brought this up, and I was just thinking, people outside of New York, they do know certain things about New York that I would never think that someone in New York would know about. And then I asked people in New York about this, and they didn't know, someone in Berlin who came to 2 of my gigs in Berlin that I did with the Grasping Straws, my friend Mallory from the Grasping Straws in 2016. This guy who came to our Berlin gigs, he came to both of our Berlin gigs, is a guy from Belarus, Belarusian guy, and he, when people find out you're from New York, they normally ask you oh, do you know this person I know from New York or something like that. And the idea is New York is a city of 8 million people, you're probably not going to know that person. But a lot of the time I actually do know that person because the New York music scene is actually kind of a small world. And this was no exception. I actually did know the guy he was talking about. He asked me, do you know Dan Costello? And me and Mallory were of course we know Dan Costello. He's so Dan Costello, he also left New York along with Rachel from his duo, Dan and Rachel, their husband and wife duo, who also, I think they still run the record label Kale Records. And they also, they left New York with their housemate, Debbie Dalton. Debbie, I don't know if you know Debbie, but Debbie Dalton's an absolutely incredible musician from the New York anti-folk scene, a great anti-folk singer who in most parts of the world would be considered a folk singer because she's very steeped in the folk tradition. And as I've talked about in some interviews recently, New York anti-folk, the reason it's called anti-folk is because of things that are very specific to the New York scene, about what happened in the West Village and the East Village and various times in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and how there was a kind of divide between those two neighborhoods, similar to the North-South divide in England, actually, the West Village, East Village divide in New York. And so a lot of artists from New York who are labeled as anti-folk artists would be considered folk artists in most places. Like in the Latin American scene, they would say, I'm a trovador, cantautor, a troubadour, singer-songwriter. But in New York, I would never really fit in with the West Village folk scene because I'm too loud for that scene. So they would say I'm anti-folk, or in other parts of the US, they'd say I'm folk punk. And in Europe now, they've started saying I'm romantic punk, thanks to France de Griesen. Shout out to France. Again, she was the one who coined that term, romantic punk. A similar story to that, to how Cindy Lee Berryhill coined the term anti-folk. She was actually the one who coined that term, and it's a similar story behind those two terms. So the reason I bring this all up is Dan Costello apparently toured in Belarus. Very few artists have ever toured in Belarus, but he did. And so that's what the Belarusian guy wanted to tell us about, was how, Dan Costello, who's from the anti-folk scene, but he's very much a folk singer, in addition to being an anti-folk singer. Though actually, he's similar to me in that he really rejects the label anti-folk in a lot of ways. But, he's like someone who did a lot for that community, and he was one of the guys who ran one of the anti-folk open mics in that scene that was did a really incredible service to that community, actually. So this Belarusian guy was talking about how, like Dan Costello was performing at like a punk squat in Belarus, and how funny it was to have, like this folk singer from New York, or anti-folk singer, folk singer, playing to like some Belarusian, street punks. And then I relayed the story of how when I met Dan Costello, he was absolutely terrified of me because I was in this unhinged noise punk duo called Violent Paint that performed at his open mic. And he was just genuinely terrified of me, I think, for at least the first year that I knew him. Eventually, I think he came to terms with the fact that I just make very unhinged music and I'm not that threatening as a person. I hope he realized that. I would not want to be terrified of me. I am terrified of me, but that's a whole other story. So anyway, I bring that up as one of many examples of how like people from Belarus might know more about New York than New Yorkers do. But I do think a lot of people don't know as much about New York real estate as New Yorkers do, because it's all we talk about. Like, that is a stereotype, and it's kind of true that, we have a conversation where like drinking coffee and we're just asking like, how much are you paying in rent? What's your landlord charging you and why? And do they turn the heating off in the winter? Is your neighbor stealing your mail? It's this sort of thing. So this is what we do know about that other people might not know about, is like petty drama that is like, not interesting to anyone outside of a certain scene, and like, what are you paying in rent? And that's why a lot of people left New York, and for other reasons, but it all comes back to real estate a lot of the time. And like people outside of New York know some really interesting stuff. Like just thinking about how Andy was the one who mentioned this. In Darwin, Lancashire, one of the gigs I did there last year, a woman from Darwin came up to me after the gig and mentioned that she has traveled to every place in New York that was ever mentioned in a Lou Reed song. And if you don't know Lou Reed's music, what that means is she's been everywhere in New York, because he's mentioned everywhere. Like, she's been to more places in New York than I've been, that's for sure. And I've been a lot of places in New York because I was a musician on the New York scene, which meant that I had to go to so many different neighborhoods where there were venues, where there were studios, where I was meeting up with different people for different reasons. And so I've seen a lot of New York, but not as much as she has. And so someone from Darwin knows more about New York than pretty much anyone in New York. Also, like, everyone in Europe and pretty much everywhere in the world who's into like food cooperatives and like natural food and things like that seems to know about the food co-op in the neighborhood I grew up in now, because apparently, and I didn't know about this, but someone from Berlin actually told me about this, that there was a documentary, I think it was just called The Co-op. Fact check me on that because I might be wrong. But basically, they made a documentary about the Park Slope Food Co-op. And I grew up in Park Slope. It's really funny because, like, no one like me could afford to live in Park Slope right now because it's basically just oligarchs and people who work for Lockheed Martin who live there. But when I was growing up, it was a very different kind of place. And I saw it go through all the different stages of gentrification from when I was born until when my family left. And the Park Slope Food Co-op is still there. It's a food cooperative, and apparently a lot of people all over the world have been inspired to start food cooperatives because of this documentary. And I think that's so sweet and so funny, because like I just remember it being like, my parents were members. I think they still are members technically, but a lot of people I know are still members of the food co-op. I never thought of it as like a big deal because I grew up in that neighborhood and I just thought, that was kind of part of the scenery. But apparently it's a big deal now. And people all over the world have started food co-ops because of this movie that somebody made a movie about the food co-op. I think a lot of people in New York don't even know about the food co-op because that was very specific to our neighborhood. There were other food co-ops in other neighborhoods, and they have different kinds of policies. Like a big thing about the Park Slope Food Co-op is they're really hardcore about you would need to be a member to shop there. I've shopped at like East Village Food Co-op a million times without being a member. And this is all kind of relative. Like, I remember when I toured with Jason Trachtenberg, he knows everything about food co-ops because he was the president of the East Village Food Co-op at one point, and he was always like bartering with people. Like when he brought groceries on that tour, he would be like, I'm a member of the East Village Food Co-op, so if you're ever in New York, I can get you a really good deal if you give me a good deal. And he got a lot of really good deals on groceries on that tour. It was really cool. So I bring that all up because it's like, he knows a lot about that kind of thing. I don't know if the average New Yorker does, but apparently people all over the world know about that food co-op. So that was really cool to find out about that. I asked some of my friends who are members of the co-op, and they were like, "Oh yeah, somebody came in and made a documentary about it." One of my friends was in it. Oh wow, that's so cool. So yeah, thanks to Andy for bringing that up because that was a really interesting thing to think about. And I'm going to make some more of these videos. Hopefully I ramble less in the next one. I'm doing some more work with the archives to release some various things for the website. That's going to be rolled out over time. In the meantime, we're releasing the third and final single from the next album, the single The Morgue, in September. And then the album is coming out on the 17th of October, and we're going to do a bunch of gigs around that release. Not all in October or this year. We're gonna space it out over time, similar to what we did with Miracle on Neon Clone Avenue, where we did a much longer tour for it in the spring of the year after we released the album, and we did a handful of gigs in the UK and in Mexico right around the time we released the album. So we're going to do something similar to that, where like we do a few gigs, maybe in Mexico, maybe in the US, we don't really know, like right around the time of the release of the album, my self-titled album, Cannonball Statman, on the 17th of October. And then we're going to do more touring, probably for it next year or even the year after. There is still these rumors going around that I'm going to release a 33 album box set of my first 33 official albums on my 33rd birthday on the 22nd of October 2026. These are rumors. I don't know if these rumors are true. So I don't know if you know if these rumors are true or not, but I don't know if they're true or not. So I can't confirm or deny these rumors. You'll have to ask someone who's, again, more prescient than I am. Again, I'm not a know-it-all. I don't know very much. So if you want to know things, you would not listen to me. You would listen to someone who is an expert or authority on things. So that's what I wanted to say about all that. And yeah, thanks for listening. And I hope you're doing really well. I'm going to be probably releasing some of my like early short films that I've rediscovered in the archives, releasing some of those on here. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, in the meantime, also, if anybody has any like live videos of me that I don't have, if you want to share those with me, if you want me to release those, I'm looking to build more of the archives of those. If you want to share those with me, if you want to keep them, your secret, that's also totally fine because they're your videos. But if you do, I'm happy to add them to the archive. Even if you think the videos are really bad, I might like them. Or, maybe I won't like them because I hate seeing myself some of the time. But maybe I'll think you're a good videographer at least. So anyway, I hope you're having a really good one, a really good weekend, a really good week, really good summer, really good winter, or whatever you're doing wherever you are. And yeah, I'll see you next time we're in the same place. Have a good one.